Hey everyone, welcome to this week's lectures. We are going to be talking about civil rights and civil liberties this week. And I'm going to go over some very specific cases with you all, some very important court cases and very important laws that really highlight what civil rights are, how they're different than civil liberties, and what is and is not protected by law. So let's start with what is and what is not protected. The Constitution actually does not contain the word equality. You can read the entire thing, it's not that long, and the word equality is not mentioned once. It was not until the 14th Amendment was passed that the federal government and the modern ideas of civil rights were codified into the Constitution. Now, there's a general pattern for civil rights and how civil rights translate into law. The first part of this pattern is that something is violated at the state level. Some individual's liberty is violated at the state level, and this violation, goes all the way up to the Supreme Court or to Congress, who has to resolve it by issuing a ruling or creating a new law. This is the case of the women's suffrage movement, which allowed women to vote and gave women total political freedom. The Civil Rights Act, which was passed by President Lyndon Baines Johnson, was also a product of this bottom up movement of a problem from a state level problem to a national level problem. And this begs the question, um, do we think states would act to guarantee civil rights without some form of federal enforcement and pressure? Some states have done this. So here's an example of women's suffrage in 1919. So in these states in red, women could vote in every single election. And you look at some states who really seem to be ahead of the curve. And this is a little strange that it's this pocket right here in the western United States where women's suffrage passes first, and it extends to Washington, Oregon, California, and it's the American West where women really are allowed the fullest political participation. But look at the American South, where there was no suffrage whatsoever, going all the way up to Pennsylvania. So some states do get ahead of the curve, but many don't. Many struggle to guarantee the rights of their citizens without some form of federal incentive, whether that incentive is a reward or a potential penalty. Now, presidents can be very helpful in terms of civil rights. They can pass laws, they can advocate for civil rights, they can also advocate against them. There have been presidents in the history of the United States who have been extremely prejudiced and who have tried to work against civil rights, or they have prioritized the rights of some groups over others. We'll talk a bit about what I mean there, prioritizing the rights of one group over others, later on in this lecture. The point being that when you have a president who is pushing for civil rights, that is a very powerful push. It is also a very powerful push when you have a president who is pushing against civil rights. Now, Congress can also pass legislation. The 14th Amendment, which we'll discuss a little later, is a very, very, very important example of this. The 14th Amendment effectively makes anyone born in the United States a citizen. And you're thinking, well, what does that have to do with civil rights? Well, I'll tell you. In the Civil Rights Act, again, really championed by LBJ but passed by Congress, made or put an end to many of these Jim Crow laws in the American South. Now, if there's a dispute between parties at the state level and somebody is suing a state for discrimination, that ends up in the courts. Sometimes it goes to the Supreme Court. Now, outside groups such as interest groups and social movements, think about Black Lives Matter. Think about, let me think of other protest groups we see today. You see these groups organize, march, write letters and try to influence policy, and sometimes they are very effective. Now, let's start with that 14th Amendment. So, this is the actual text of it. And you notice when you're reading this text, one, you may not know what all the words are, but two, what it's really talking about is anyone who was born in the United States are guaranteed the rights of United States citizens. This is passed in 1868. That's very important because what this law, or who this law is written for, are now freed slaves. This is a law that says all freed slaves and their children, they are citizens of the United States, and therefore they enjoy equal protection under the law. Their rights cannot be violated expressly by any state law. Now, all the northern states were for this. All the southern states rejected it. So Congress says, you know what? We're going to pass it, but now we are going to pass something called the Reconstruction Act 2. Reconstruction was the military occupation of the American South. And the American South was occupied in order to guarantee that state police, local police, other law enforcement weren't going around and actively killing black Americans. Now, this military occupation ends, and for the ending of this military occupation, or I'm sorry, let me rephrase. Many have criticized the ending of this military occupation as premature, because after Northern troops leave, of course, the Ku Klux Klan really gets a hold in the American South. But that's another story for another slide. The 15th Amendment. Let's read the text of this together. The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States by any account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The Congress shall have the power to enforce this by appropriate legislation. Now, a few things here. On account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So, states after the Civil War could not bar people from voting if they were black. But there's nothing in there about education, is there? Well, the Southern politician argues, shouldn't we want our electorate to be informed and intelligent regardless of their race? Okay, sure. You want an informed, intelligent electorate. Well, then wouldn't it make sense, these politicians argue, to have a literacy requirement? This is an example of Jim Crow. You have literacy laws spring up all across the American South saying that people need to pass a reading test prior to being able to vote. The problem? States could determine how these tests look. They could make them as hard or as easy as they wanted to. And quite frankly, it was illegal to teach slaves to read during slavery. So many black Americans at this period could not read. This is a problem of de facto discrimination. And we'll talk more about that in the subsequent slides. But also, there's nothing in here about allowing women to vote. So, in theory, black men could vote before women. Now, this is passed in the same way as the 14th Amendment. The northern states really, really like it. The southern states oppose it. And then President Grant, famous for leading the Union Army in the Civil War, strong arms other states into passing this amendment really through military occupation. So there are two kinds of discrimination. There's de jure discrimination. This is laws that expressly deny civil rights. Now, this is what a lot of people say. They say, oh, okay, so this law does not expressly say you cannot do this because you are not white. Sure, the laws do not literally say that. Why don't they say that? Because it's illegal. But there is de facto discrimination. This is discrimination that exists without explicit laws. So after the Civil War does away with de jure discrimination, states and national governments both still had types of discrimination in their laws and in their practices. think about segregation? Well, certainly it doesn't say that anyone cannot segregate. Why? Because separate but equal. So if you have two facilities and they're both equal, well, then that's permissible. That's not discrimination. Segregation, for many, 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 many decades, was not recognized as discrimination, if you can believe such a thing. It's in World War II that the seeds of change really take root. So, first, you have to understand how World War II was phrased. It was phrased as a battle of democracy versus dictatorship, democracy versus fascism, and then communism. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union would often say the United States talks a big game about keeping people free. But a black man and a black woman in the United States are not free. They are free in the Soviet Union. So now a question begins to emerge. To what extent are we really fighting for freedom if you have 100,000 black troops fighting in the war who cannot enjoy the same rights as their fellow Americans when they come home defending their country? Now, in 1909, a very important interest group was formed, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This is significant because, one, it is one of the first major organizations of black Americans in the United States. It has defined itself and it is challenging society. This is a very big development in the history of civil rights. Now, in 1941, this is in the midst of World War II, FDR creates the Fair Employment Practices Committee. This bans racial discrimination by defense contractors. Why do you want no racial discrimination in defense contracting? Well, the Army has a shortage of bullets. Who do you want to build bullets? Literally anyone available. It turns out when a nation is on the edge of a military loss, racial discrimination starts to matter less and less. Now, Truman follows this up with an executive order. And this executive order says, it is hereby declared to be the policy of the president that there shall be equality of treatment of opportunity for all persons in the armed forces without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. This gets to an interesting relationship between civil rights and the military. Now, for your guys' lifetime, you've heard all this talk of a woke military. And what I'm here to tell you is the military has always been ahead of the social curve. There's a reason the military has been ahead of the social curve. The military is an essential arm of the government. Everyone in government views the military to be essential. Therefore, it is a priority that the military is funded and it is staffed. And that latter part is critical. Policymakers, by and large, tend to want anyone to join the military who can. Because of this, the military has been, by its nature, a social laboratory. And very rightly, I think, generals today recognize that racism cannot really survive, or racism is rather detrimental to a cohesive armed forces. It's really difficult to be in a foxhole with someone if you're worried that they're a white supremacist, right? So the military has tended to be a social laboratory. The military was ahead of the curve in recognizing the rights of gay Americans. The military has been a bit ahead of the curve in this I don't want to say this trans debate, but in the conversation around trans identity. Now, troops are also called in to protect civil rights. Reconstruction, after all, was the military occupation of the American South. And here's a picture of the National Guard escorting the Little Rock Nine to school. The National Guard was called in to make sure that these African American kids could get to school without being killed by white people. So, my question to you all is, should the military be law enforcement for civil rights? Do we think that the question of civil rights is so important that we can kind of say, okay, I guess the military should be called in to protect civil rights? Or do we think, wait a minute, could this open the door for the military to be deployed for other purposes inside the United States? We'll pick up here with specific cases in the judiciary in our next video.